and we also will have some discussion as well. We're asking our panelists to please observe 10 minutes as the approximate time of your presentation. We want to go right to the panel and to begin now. Begin with Helga Sepp-LaRouche, the editor-in-chief of Executive Intelligence Review, as well as the founder of the Schiller Institute, and she's speaking to us from Germany. Welcome, Helga.
Hello.
Please go.
Well, we are assembled here to put out an analysis of what the dangers are if the United States goes ahead and goes for a regime change operation in Venezuela. But we are also intending to portray how the world can get out of this crisis. Now, obviously, the operation in Venezuela, which is more or less ready to go, and if you look at the number of warships assembled close to Venezuela, is not a thing in itself. We should remember that President Trump had won, especially his second term, with the promise that he would end the endless wars of America. And a lot of his base, the MAGA base, is basically intending to insist that he sticks to that policy. Now, this takes obviously place at a moment where Trump is having already enormous difficulties with the support of his base, as was demonstrated through his attacks on Marjorie Taylor Greene and some of his other supporters over the issue of the release of the Epstein files. So it's a very fragile moment for President Trump to risk more rifts between him and his base. Now, obviously, we have to differentiate between the narrative of what is here at stake and what is really the real issue involved. Now, if you look at the official statements, it's all about Maduro being the head of the cartel of the Suns. And, while President Trump a couple of days ago still said he was potentially open for direct talks with President Maduro, only hours afterwards, the State Department and Marco Rubio put out a statement declaring the cartel of the Suns terrorist organizations and Maduro the head of it. And this is supposed to go into effect on Monday, whereby this would legitimize any kind of military operation. There are also reports that the orders have been given already for CIA covert operations inside Venezuela, and so forth and so on. Now, there are many military experts, and I will only touch upon it because I'm sure that others on this panel will give more insight into that the argument that fentanyl is coming from Venezuela to the United States cannot be maintained at all. And, obviously there is already a huge outcry internationally over the fact that the US military changed their policy of interception of drug boats and bringing the alleged drug pushers in front of trials by simply shooting at these boats and killing people. I think altogether 83 people were killed already out of any legal framework and without any due process. So if you look at all of that, the big question naturally is, what is this really all about? In a context, where, the tensions between the United States and Russia, China, the BRICS are mounting, it is quite noteworthy. There is an article in Foreign Affairs written by Elliot Abrams, which spills the beans in the most direct form. An article which says how to topple Maduro. He says that to remove Maduro is really to end the cooperation of Venezuela with China, Cuba, Iran, and Russia. because Venezuela gave them a base of operation in Latin America. So Trump, he advises, should end all ambiguity and not only fight against the symptoms, which is the drugs, the migrants, the trafficking in human beings, but go for the root causes, which is remove the Maduro regime. Basically, he also then accounts that in the New York, according to the New York Times, Marco Rubio secretly met with leaders of the House and the Senate to tell them that, this is not the ousting of Maduro is not the objective. But he says, if that's not the objective, then it is very difficult to explain why such a gigantic armada of US warships is close to the coast of Venezuela. And then basically giving out travel warnings to American cities not to go into Venezuela, describing the internal domestic condition of Venezuela practically as hell on earth. Then he reiterates that, given the fact that Cuba has already supported Maduro's bureaucracy and military against potential coups, that, the American prestige and Trump's prestige and America's credibility is on the line. And he urges his advisors to urgently persuade Trump that he is already at a point of no return. The game is on. Either he wins or Maduro wins. And I think that shows you the kind of manipulation which is attempted by what one clearly can call the neocons in the Trump administration, of which Marco Rubio is obviously a key proponent. So I think it's very important that the magazine of Record, Foreign Affairs, which is the official magazine of what you can call the official establishment of the neocons in the United States, basically says quite openly the issue is China, Cuba, Iran, and Russia. And that is very interesting because, we have to look at the larger picture. And what is the larger picture? The attempt by the Western establishments to establish an unipolar world at the end of the Cold War based on the Anglo-American special relationship, as we now have seen, completely backfired. It was a gigantic blowback because all the measures which went along with that effort to establish an unipolar dominance in the world went along with regime change, color revolution, sanctions, unilateral sanctions not legitimized by the UN Security Council, the weaponization of the dollar, and many other such measures, interventionist wars, not to forget, like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya. The sum of all of that has led to a situation, combined with the rise of China, that the countries of the global south basically saw for the first time to overcome the condition of 500 years of colonialism by allying with China, with the Belt and Road Initiative, and with the BRICS countries, with whom they are now in the process of establishing a new economic system, which got another major step ahead with the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, meeting on the 31st of August and September 1st, an organization which is explicitly is not meant as a counter bloc to NATO, but it is an organization which is open to any country who wishes to cooperate, including the United States, including European nations. However, the Western nations, at least some of them, especially in Europe, the coalition of the willing, have obviously tied their fate so much to the neoliberal system, which attempted the unipolar world order, which, however, did not function, that they insist of not giving up on the war of Ukraine by insisting that Russia must suffer a strategic defeat, even if everybody knows who thinks clearly that a strategic defeat of Russia is not possible, given the fact that it is the strongest nuclear power on the planet, and all an attack on Russia could lead to is the annihilation of the human species as a whole, followed, by a global nuclear war and global nuclear winter. So therefore, we have now a situation where obviously, unfortunately, still in the line of the strategic ambiguity, President Trump did obviously attempt to remedy the relation with Russia. That was the purpose of his meeting in Anchorage in Alaska. And just yesterday, both from Steve Witkoff and Kirill Dmitriev came again the news that what was already discussed in Alaska, namely an agreement to end the Ukraine war by making an agreement whereby Ukraine would give up most of the territory lost in the war, the Donbass, the Crimea, agree to halve its military, but then have security guarantees from the United States. And, this would be part of an overall security arrangement involving all of Europe. So that naturally has been rejected by the coalition of the willing so far, but it is now a renewed proposal on the table. And it is also very clear that the Trump administration did want to leave the Ukraine war, because that war is clearly coming to an end simply because of a lack of manpower. And, this war has been exhausted. So when the United States put out their recent new security doctrine, it said that the main emphasis of US interest will be the Western Hemisphere, which, observers already were worrying could mean, to try to treat Latin America not only as the US neighborhood, as Marco Rubio called it the other day, but, as the so-called backyard, whereby any kind of presence or influence of Russia, China, and other countries would be tried to eliminate. So this is the context in which this operation is taking place. And I think, if it goes ahead and, would lead to either a regime change, driving President Maduro out of Venezuela one way or another, including military operations, including covert operations, it could lead to an absolute disaster for the United States. In all likelihood, it would absolutely increase all the problems it is supposed to be a remedy against. It would increase poverty, it would increase drug trade, it would massively increase the migrant crisis. It could lead to an alliance of many Latin American countries against the United States. And in the worst case, it could lead to an entanglement and worse with Russia, if not China. So that is what is at stake. And, we have been maintaining for a very long time that the only way how we will get out of this geopolitical crisis, get the Western nations, including the United States, but also European nations, to stop the geopolitical confrontation and the effort to contain China and Russia and other BRICS countries, and to simply switch to a mode of cooperation. If the United States would drop the effort to drive China out of Latin America and instead start to cooperate with the Bi-Oceanic Railway, to use the fact that China successfully has built the deep water port in Shanghai, in Peru, and simply agree to the kind of infrastructure projects which have been on the table since Alexander of Humboldt in the 19th century, and which would eliminate the reason for migration, because it would give people an incentive to stay home and build up their own economies, then all the problems could be solved. Now, that would basically mean that President Trump would go back to his MAGA policy, Make America Great by concentrating on the economic build-up of the United States. And one can only hope that reasonable forces, both inside the United States and in all of the Western Hemisphere, could cooperate to put that on the agenda. So I want to stop here and leave the word to others.
Thank you very much, Helga. And if you've just joined us, welcome to our virtual roundtable discussion, President.Trump, Don't Do It, an alternative American policy for the Caribbean. Now, this is an international emergency symposium brought to you by the Executive Intelligence Review magazine, which stands for Reason in a Time of Crisis. And you have just heard Helga Sepp-LaRouche, the editor-in-chief of Executive Intelligence Review, as well as the founder of the Schiller Institute. She spoke to us from Germany. Our next speaker is Diego Sequeira. Mr. Sequeira is a well-known Venezuelan journalist who is a researcher and columnist for this Venezuelan publication, MisionVerdad.com. He speaks to us from Caracas, Venezuela. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here sharing this panel with all of you, and also thankful for the concern regarding our country, and of course, like everything else in this region, it's all intertwined, and it not only involves the country. And taking from where Madame Sepp-LaRouche have left the conversation, I would like to address immediately and thank you all, and especially a warm welcome, by the way, to my neighbors to the south and the east in this panel, just to reaffirm that we're all in this together some way or another, either happily, willfully, or not. But this is going to have many reverberations across the whole hemisphere. And I know we're all on the same page, nevertheless. Anyways, yes, it's clear now at this point that all we're talking about, the drug indictments and all and everything, and the concerns about narco-terrorism and so forth, it's just basically a very thin-veiled cloud to justify these operations. This is, of course, a regime change operation, but even more so, I think it also is a regional change operation. This goes beyond the Venezuelan frame, and it touches many other places. Even already now, if we follow the whole extrajudiciary killings that we've seen with the small boats throughout the Caribbean, it already is a Caribbean situation. It already has victims that are not only Venezuelans, it also involves now Colombians and Trinidadians, and on the Eastern Pacific as well, which involves Colombians one more time, and also Mexicans. So this is not only a thing about Venezuela. Venezuela could be currently the flashpoint, and it could be the main obstacle also at this very moment. But it clearly goes beyond this. You could also pair this with what's going on with, for example, in Argentina, and see how all these dynamics are actually interconnected in some way or another. Maybe let's call it support, if you may, what have already happened in Argentina with a massive funding for Milei in order to not lose the parliamentary elections. And at the same time, the pressure that Venezuela, of course, has been going through right now, which is, of course, not new at all. It has a major difference now, of course, with the massive buildup in the Caribbean, but this is nothing new in the last decade for the Venezuelan people. And this, of course, involves, once, let's hypothetically say Venezuela's out of the picture, this involves, of course, expelling the multipolar players that are already engaging in trade and policy in the whole region, not only in Venezuela. Venezuela being perhaps the most dynamic pole of the whole countries right now, but we cannot say, for example, that China doesn't have trade with even countries that could see themselves as hostiles to what China actually represents. But this is about expelling multipolarity, regional reshaping, and keeping a hold in order to, that's what it seems, to face the Asian century, to have enough space, sorry for the word, but the Lebensraum that the US empire needs right now in order to be able to face and cope its current decline and the means and resources and cheap labor to face up the emerging world, the possible emerging world that it's already here. Now, we can now clearly establish one more thing. This is not a matter of truth. This is a very unsophisticated way to reproduce what we saw back in 2003. But I think one of the reasons, and maybe a symptomatic reason of this all, is that it doesn't matter anymore. This is, I'm sorry if I'm going to be rude right now, but this is FU reality more than post-truth or policy that's meant to persuade anyone about what's currently happening and what needs to be done regarding quote-unquote hostiles in the hemisphere. I think it doesn't matter anymore. And one proof of this is the way that precisely how Marco Rubio is actually outmaneuvering any other possibility within the current administration in order to keep a firm grip. This is, oh, by the way, a pattern that we don't need to see it only in the region. Regarding Venezuela, we have seen how Richard Grenell, Trump's personal envoy to Venezuela, was sidelined. But we can see the same thing, what happened with the Gaza dossier, what happened with Ukraine and the connections among him and, for example, Lindsey Graham in the case of Gaza, with Netanyahu himself. And this is Marco Rubio's moment, Marco Rubio's show. And I can easily say that perhaps he's the most dangerous person in the world right now, even more dangerous than Netanyahu himself. So, and now that we talk about this, I think we should also address a very urgent issue, which is now the transfer, the bringing over of the Gaza paradigm into Venezuela. And there are two very good examples of this and how this is becoming a model, a template, a very dangerous one. One of them is the nature of the recently announced Southern Spear operation by Secretary of War Hegseth, which basically it was written already, it was already issued back in January. So it's now going official in many ways, which basically, if you see it properly, it gives away the whole surveillance capabilities to the tech bros behemoth, especially Palantir. So we're talking about now about shaping up even of war and surveillance that is partially privatized, it's partially under control of very powerful oligarchs, and it's all by itself a war package, which brings all this high tech, it brings all this proxy sort of privatized approach to war. It's not to reduce even a state-to-state situation. And the other thing is how almost 80 victims of the current situation of the last 2 months, the wording of the Pentagon at this moment, of the Pentagon legal office, it's basically they're unprivileged belligerents. They have no kind of identification. Of course, it runs against all the procedures regarding drug indictments and so forth, as have been upheld by the communique of the former leaders of CARICOM. I mean, this goes completely against this notion, because there's even a philosophical and moral element to this. There's a certification on how even less than before human life itself values, and has any value to any of these players, let's call it that way. How much this goes even further in that sense. And I think this is not a minor thing. Nevertheless, if you walk in Caracas, and I also drove 500 kilometers back and forth a couple of days ago throughout the country, you don't have the feeling that there's a massive tensions, that there's no major social breakdown or upheaval or any kind of thing that's going on within Venezuelan society, which also shows you how used we are to this kind of things, and also how unimpressed, regardless of the nature of the threats that we're going through. Venezuela, as you know, it also has been a staunch defender and supporter of the UN Charter. And I think this is not a minor detail. Precisely when they're sidelining everything, you should all remember, by the way, when Marco Rubio himself said, we don't care what the UN says about the drug flows coming out from Venezuela, which also explains how much this is actually not the case, how much it's not the actual concern, and how much this, as already has been addressed, doesn't solve any kind of and not even close the narcotic situation, because it's already been misrepresented from the start, and it shows also a analytical failure that will shape up a very dangerous kind of strategy that I think we're already seeing it. So this is a moment, regardless of how defectious it could be, how imperfect the current international law framework is, we still have to uphold it and defend it in this context and throughout the world, and be more outspoken about it. So it's even concerning how many even Latin American governments, and let's not say the Europeans, are actually silent about the situation that's going on, which also echoes the Gaza method, how this silence is useful in order to ensue or to pursue their own interest the hardest way possible regarding the global south. Because yes, this is geopolitics, this is a human element, but it's also, of course, obviously a matter of resources. How all this AI tech, all this fourth industrial revolution madness is going to work without the extraction of each and every resources that are now currently on the global south. So just to wrap up, I think that one of the main danger out of this, especially for the calculations and the mechanical automatic calculations it seems to be like the rationale behind, especially Rubio. I'm not talking about Trump at this point, because I do believe he could go he could accept even we can, given the current dialogue, between the possibility between Venezuela and the US government, I am sure that he could get halfway and be satisfied about some sort of agreement. That's not the case, of course, with Rubio. This going forward could become now a very new way of blowback central, as if already Madame Zeb LaRouche has already addressed it. And I think this is one of the most important elements that we should also take care about the threats, and about how this is going to have a massive impact beyond our hemisphere. So I'd like to thank you very much for this invitation. I hope this contribution can be helpful in order for the next phase of this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sequeira. And if you've just joined us, again, welcome to our virtual roundtable discussion, President Trump, Don't Do It, an alternative American policy for the Caribbean. This is an international emergency symposium brought by the Executive Intelligence Review magazine. And you just heard Diego Sequeira, journalist and researcher from Venezuela. Our next speaker is President Donald Ramotar, former president of Guyana from 2011 to 2015, and he's speaking to us from Georgetown, Guyana. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm very pleased to be part of this distinguished panel. I must say that not since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 in the Caribbean, in the kind of danger that we are of war that we are experiencing right now. The United States has amassed a huge amount of modern military equipment in the South Caribbean Sea, right on the borders with Venezuela, having some of its most modern and most powerful equipment there. The fig leaf that is being used to fight against narco criminals. President Trump is claiming that drugs from Venezuela are killing many Americans. Yet the facts does not correspond to his assertion. A previous UN official has announced that Venezuela is one of the least countries that tolerate narco criminals. It has pointed out that the UN report on drug trade in 2025 has not identified Venezuela as a problem. So too is the European Union report, which has not mentioned Venezuela in passing in its 2025 report. This, therefore, is a false flag to serve as a pretext for attacking Venezuela to carry out regime change. This is an old tactic used by aggressors to destroy progressive and democratic forces. One such famous event was the Reichstag fire trial of February 1933, when Hitler destroyed this parliament to give an excuse to destroy the communist and other democratic forces in Germany. Since then, the United States have used this method repeatedly. It was used in Vietnam in 1964, popularly known as the Gulf of Tonkin event. That began an 11-year war to destroy Vietnam's communist government and the liberation forces in the South. It was used recently in Iraq in the famous weapons of mass destruction. Anti-communism was the other excuse that was used in the 1950s and 1960s to attack the PVP government in Guyana. It was used in Cuba too to attack the Cuban government, and in 1970s used against the government of Allende in Chile. If drug was really the issue in Venezuela, the United States should be dealing with the very large market that it provides for the drug trade. That is where it should be concentrating its efforts. Moreover, it could use its considerable power to stop the illegal gun flow, the illegal gun trade that fuels crime in our hemisphere. At the same time, it has the power to deal with the banks in the United States that are laundering most of the drug money. Clearly, this talk about drugs is nothing else but a false flag operation. The real reason lies in the fact that since the elections of President Hugo Chavez in 1998 in Venezuela, Venezuela adopted a more patriotic stance and has also changed the orientation of the government as from the previous Christian Democratic Party and the Action Democratic Politics, which were at that time pro-American and pro-capitalist in its orientation. Chavez wanted the considerable wealth of Venezuela, particularly oil wealth, to service the needs of the poor in his country and to assist in the development of Latin America and the Caribbean. This was to the U.S. and Atadma. This they could not tolerate, since they feel that the U.S. must dominate the world, and Latin American Caribbean in particular. In 1945, President Truman said that, and I quote, "For our American system to survive, it must be the world system," unquote. Years later, in the 1980s, President Reagan repeated that.
I think we may have a problem with this connection. Okay. We're going to just give it a moment to see if we can restore that. And if not, we'll return to go to the next speaker. And perhaps we can have President Ramatar finish his remarks. Okay, just go ahead. All right, fine. We're going to go to our next speaker. If you happen to have just joined us, you are watching a virtual roundtable discussion, President Trump, Don't Do It, an alternative American policy for the Caribbean. This is an international emergency symposium brought to you by EIR, or Executive Intelligence Review magazine. Next speaker is Ray McGovern, co-founder of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, and he's speaking to us from North Carolina in the United States. Welcome, Ray.
Thank you, Dennis. It certainly is an honor and a privilege to be with you today, and especially to follow President Ramatar. I'd like to contribute something that I am a beneficiary of, simply by reason of my old age, okay? The question is, why Venezuela and why now? Some of you may remember the island of Grenada, not Grenada, Grenada. It was 4.5 decades ago, but some of you were probably very young. I was 44, so I remember it well because I was working in Washington. Now, what do I mean by adducing this example? This historical example that I happen to know firsthand in and out. Well, in 1983, there was a disaster in the Marine barracks in Beirut. 241 Marines were killed by a bomb, okay? This was a humiliation beyond compare. And Ronald Reagan had to figure out what to do. On that occasion, he was sensible enough to say, what the hell were those Marines doing there? Why was there no security? Why didn't the Israelis tell us about it? Get them out of there. They went out onto ships, and then several weeks later, they came home. But, now what is this but? The U.S. had to demonstrate that it was still very strong. You don't let these humiliations go by without reaction. And so they chose the small island of Grenada. Why? Well, because there were some leftist leaders there who were threatening to take hostages of U.S. medical students there. And they were threatening this. And besides, Grenada had Cubans on the island. And so Reagan, assisted by his Secretary of Defense, it was defense then, now it's war. His name was Weinberger. And he was just as fierce as Hegseth without the fancy hairdo and the nice clothes, okay? Now, again, I know this firsthand. They advised Reagan, look, let's send the 82nd Airborne in to rescue those medical students. They're going to be taken hostages. And even after those leftist rulers in Grenada cried uncle, that means, okay, all right, you can do what you want. We'll do it. Yeah, we'll give them back. The Weinberger folks went in with the 82nd Airborne because we needed to show how strong we were. That's what that was all about. Now, that's a historical example, okay? Fast forward how many years to 2025. Whoa, humiliation? My God, the whole world is against this. Now, Putin, in his nice attitude toward the United States, says that, well, when we were all in Beijing, that is, most of the world represented by most of the world's leaders, we didn't say anything bad about you, President Trump. But there they were. What a visible example of how power in the world had changed. Add to that, Ukraine, NATO losing. Add to that, Epstein. Add to that, all kinds of domestic problems, a shutdown. So what you have here months ago is a change in U.S. policy, okay? Well, you could call it multilateral or polycentric or whatever, but it was a recognition by Trump, hey, we can't do much about China. We can't do much about Ukraine. So let's show our muscle in our own neighborhood, as Rubio calls it. So there was actually a policy amendment, a policy document added to the defense guidance, which said, look, from now on, we're going to concentrate on the Western Hemisphere, Monroe Doctrine, right? And attend to our own domestic problems by using the United States Armed Forces, despite the Constitution of the United States, internally to solve our own problems. So our hemisphere and our country. That was written allegedly by the most hawkish China person. Eldridge Cobley was his name. So that came out, and we saw a retrenchment with respect to the rest of the world, but not with respect to Venezuela. Venezuela became the new Grenada. Now, I'm speculating that Venezuela is the new Grenada, but I'm telling you, the facts on Grenada are facts, okay? Now, the analogy, you can say it's speculation, but I think that a major reason why Trump is rattling the sabers there outside of in the Caribbean against Venezuela is largely that. Now, what does that mean? Well, we talked a lot about Rubio, and I believe that everything said about Rubio was absolutely correct. One fly in the ointment is that Rubio is not only Secretary of State, he is also National Security Advisor. So intelligence, such as it is, that wants to get to the president has to go through the National Security Advisor. Seems to me quite clear that little Marco Rubio is behind all this. Now, my God, that's bad news because we know his record. We know he wants to do not only Venezuela, but Cuba and whatever else leftists or communists are out there, okay? Are there any glimmers of hope? Yes, there are. Rubio is not ruling the roost in other areas. I think that he has been circumvented by Witkoff and the president himself with respect to Ukraine. Rubio's comments on Ukraine and Russia are 180 degrees away from U.S. policy. So this may be slim hope, but it is a hope that if Trump can see the light and overrule Rubio on such things as Ukraine and Russia, by the time he realizes that an invasion, my God, of Venezuela would be Vietnam 2.0, and that he would inevitably, well, maybe not before he left town, but the United States would inevitably lose that one. And the fact that, the world has changed so much that you cannot rule out. I would have said 2 years ago, the Russians will never go anywhere near Venezuela. Well, the Chinese, come on. But that's different now. I don't know exactly what they're going to do, but they're going to support Venezuela to the extent that they feel it's safe to do so. So somebody sensible needs to talk to Trump. Somebody has to go around Rubio and say, look, little Marco is wrong about this one. You're going to get a peck of trouble if you do what we all hope you don't do in Venezuela. I'll end it up there. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Ray. And I just want to have you reference just briefly, well, I'll reference actually, the statement that Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity brought out about this matter. Probably in the period of the discussion, we can go into that a bit more. I see that President Ramotar is back, and I also should mention that there was a statement that was done by the former presidents of the Caribbean. So, President Ramotar, are you there? And if so, please continue.
Yeah, that I was saying that the United States doesn't want to tolerate any country that tries to do anything differently than what they are proposing. And I said that explains a lot of what is happening in Cuba, where they create a lot of hardships and then blame the Cuban government for the problems. Therefore, any attempt of any country to assert sovereignty over their natural resources will meet the hostility of the United States and their allies. The other factor that is fueling America's aggression is its effort to hamstring China's development. It sees China as a threat, not because China is threatening war on it. On the contrary, China has always been promoting peace and friendship. It has evolved a new kind of foreign policy, described as a win-win policy, which is very attractive to the long-suffering peoples of the South in particular, but even for more developed countries as well. Its relations with countries of the global South have benefited those countries greatly. The infrastructural projects have enhanced economic prospects of many countries in the South, including in our own region. The new port in Peru stands out as a beacon of win-win approach and a monument to China-Latin America friendship and cooperation. These effects have infuriated the hawks in the United States. The United States is now using its considerable power to try to displace China in the South. During the Biden presidency, the G7 countries had a meeting the last meeting that he attended of the G7 countries, created a special fund, not necessarily to help the people of the South, but as they stated very frankly, to counter the Belt and Road Initiative of China. And that is what they were using it for. Even though that was so, it was an anti-Chinese plan. The China still welcomed their participation and saw it as having more resources to try to help the development of the South, and even promised to cooperate and to in the development of our world. They saw it as another possibility that cooperation can bring, make a contribution to world peace. Unfortunately, the US has rejected that approach and has adopted a strong militaristic line to achieve their quest to maintain global dominance. This is fully in display in the Middle East, where the genocidal war is taking place. Even though they have a peace agreement, we see them killing up to today. They killed more than 25 Palestinians by bombing in the Gaza. This is the root of the conflict also in Europe. The ill-conceived idea to ignore Russia's legitimate security concerns and to attempt to use Ukraine as a proxy for NATO to oppose Russia is at the heart of what is happening there today. The US system is being threatened by the emergence of a new multipolar world, the emergence of the BRICS countries, and the recent surge of new members is challenging the total dominance of the United States. It is offering alternatives to countries and even now adopting new trading and financial systems that is removing the monopoly of US power. These events have done a great deal to expose the extent to which the US seems ready to go to maintain its position. It is openly ignoring international laws, as we see right now in the killings in the Caribbean of people who we don't, at least I am not even sure who they are. They're branding them as narco-terrorists, but they have the power to stop those boats and check and provide the evidence, but they choose instead to kill instead of to arrest. We see it in the Middle East. We see it with, as I said, what is taking place here. That is done, and the US has also been attacking international institutions apart from flouting international laws. They have been attacking international institutions when it cannot bend it to its own will. This is done in various ways. We see it is completely working with Israel to sabotage the UN, a lot of UN position on Gaza. It has banned Francisca Albanese, a UN special rapporteur, because she dared to speak the truth about the genocide among other UN persons. It has also putting pressure on the International Criminal Court, because the Criminal Court is recommending charging Netanyahu for genocide, the crime of genocide that is taking place. The Iranians too have accused the International Atomic Energy Agency of pushing the US agenda and spying and using it to spy for Israel and the United States. That, they claim, was how many of their leading scientists and military personnel were assassinated in their homes, helped to direct their fire to their direction to the nuclear facilities. United Nations resolutions are routinely disregarded if they do not fit into the US purposes. Attempts are made to use the UN itself as a tool for its foreign policy. Only recently, Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov accused the UN Secretariat of carrying out American directions. All these actions only serve to discredit and undermine these important international institutions, which could have unforetold consequences for poor countries like ours. Colleagues, the international socio-economic and political situation is at an important juncture. On the one hand, the old exploitative imperialist neo-colonialist system has become openly hostile to any attempts to create a more just and humane world. Military measures are more and more being resorted to maintain the status quo. On the other hand, the contours of a new world order have already taken shape. This is represented by the growth of the BRICS, as I've said before, and which is announcing its appearance it is announcing the appearance of a multipolar world. This, I believe, is the main contradiction of our time, and it is impacting on almost every important issue of our times, whether it is the war and peace, whether it is the ecological crisis facing our entire planet, and the struggle for a more just and equitable world, because it offers a viable alternative to the neo-colonial, neoliberal model of development. This is what characterizes the situation in our region today. The U.S. presence is driving fear and or deep concern in almost all the governments of the region. Fear of the U.S. open interference, as we see, is the attitude of the governments of the region. They are either deafeningly silenced on what is taking place on their doorsteps, or they are trying to appease the United States by saying that they support their anti-crime fight. The stakes are too high to be silent. That is why the statement by former heads of governments of the Caribbean on the potentially explosive situation in the region is very important. So too is the warning of the serious consequences that would arise from such misadventures given to President Trump by veteran intelligence professionals for Sanity, issued on November 5th. U.S. intervention in Venezuela has the potential of generating untold negative consequences. It would result in massive loss of lives, as we saw in Iraq, Vietnam, and in the Balkans in the 1990s. It could cause a worse refugee crisis, the likes of which we have never experienced in this region. It would lead to many unforeseen negative consequences, and that at the moment we probably still don't see. And as someone mentioned, that with the possibility of other forces coming into the assistance of Venezuela, it can even pose threat to the world. Even at this late hour, let us demand for common sense to prevail. Diplomatic efforts must be intensified on the one hand. On the other hand, though, we must encourage mass intervention. International solidarity is most vital to prevent another catastrophe in our world. We have had enough, and we must have the participation of our people to try to prevent this dangerous situation. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, President Ramatar. And for those who just joined us, you've just been listening to Donald Ramatar, former president of Guyana, who spoke to us from Guyana. This is the Emergency Roundtable Discussion, President Trump Don't Do It, sponsored by Executive Intelligence Review. Our next speaker is Beto Almeida. He's one of the founders of Telesur, an Ibero-American TV network headquartered in Caracas, Venezuela. He's also on the advisory board of the Brazilian Press Association, founded in 1908. And he's speaking to us from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Welcome.
Muchas gracias. Un saludo a todos.
Thank you very much. Greetings to all of you. It's a great honor to be here with you today in this roundtable discussion. And the title of the roundtable says everything. That is, don't do it, President Trump. And to have an alternative policy from the United States towards the Caribbean. That's what the issue is. Because the world has changed greatly. And And President Trump was reelected with the idea that he should reconstruct the policies inside the United States because the United States has lost its dynamic advances, and that's a problem of the last decades. And the policies over the last decades that the United States has been practicing, and there's now a need for an industrial recovery in the United States, but that industrial recovery cannot be carried out by opening up yet another war front, especially a war that could cause convulsions in not only Venezuela, the Caribbean, but all of Latin America. The world is changing, and the United States has not been able to join in with that rate of change and to join that with a cooperative approach in that changing world. But the case of Venezuela is one which, in its full rights, organized its own transformations, its social changes, the Bolivarian Revolution, and stopped being an oil colony of the United States. That's legitimate. This was an aspiration of theirs, and they started using their own oil for development. Their internal policies, eliminating illiteracy to make enormous investments in public housing, all of that is something that's very important for a population such as that of Venezuela, half of whom, before the arrival of Hugo Chavez to Miraflores Palaces, that half didn't even have an electoral credential. They didn't participate in the elections. But Venezuela has changed greatly, but clearly that changes were not accepted by Washington, precisely because Venezuela started using its oil, was no longer dependent, and it stopped being a colony to have sovereignty, oil, cultural, economic, political sovereignty. And that created much discomfort in Washington, which does not accept this from 2013 forward. Well, in 2013, when Obama declared a war, a kind of war against Venezuela by decreeing that Venezuela was a threat to the interests of the United States. But what kind of threat? Because it practices internal sovereignty, because it was able to achieve now, for example, self-sufficiency in productive self-sufficiency in food. That is not harmful to the United States. And Venezuela never stopped providing oil to the United States, which is a great purchaser. It's the big purchaser. It just began to charge a price which was more equitable. They weren't giving it away at a colonial price, but their sovereignty has to be respected in this. So at the same time, we see once again how false flags are being used, which have been used in the past in so many other occasions by the United States itself, against Brazil, when the democratic government of João Goulart was overthrown in 1964, against Chile, against other countries, and also to promote war against Iraq and Libya, Syria. All of that means a process which is going to take the world to the very edge of a general conflagration. I believe that the roundtable has an excellent purpose, a clear purpose. This is necessary and a legitimate purpose. But at the same time, what should the policy of the United States be to be able to recover its dynamic economic position, which it once had in the past? To make more wars, or instead to invest productively in recovery, as many other countries want to do, which Brazil wants to do, a policy of economic reconstruction to recover dynamic industrialization, which is the economy in Brazil has been harmed recently in Brazil, recent years. We've undergone a process of deindustrialization, while the countries that make up the BRICS today have the possibility of of cooperating among themselves in even broader cooperation and to have productive investment of the sort that China is carrying out, but also Russia, also Iran, and various other countries, opening up the possibilities for humanity to establish a way of cooperative existence. Why not accept such an approach? Why not join that? But clearly, policies such as those of Marco Rubio are policies and positions which want to prioritize war. They are intolerant, they are unilateral, and not admit or accept that the world is changing. The world is changing. The use of false flags against Venezuela, accusing it of being a narco terrorist, of being narco trafficking, this is absolutely insulting. There is no evidence whatsoever. The evidence are that Venezuela has transformed itself significantly, economically, socially, and to be able to produce its own food, as well as to elevate the population culturally in the fields of education, as well as to lower, for example, in terms of infant mortality. So these are accomplishments. These are achievements of the Bolivarian Revolution, which have to be accepted and admitted because they're recognized by organizations such as ECLA, UNESCO, which recognize Venezuela as an area that's free of illiteracy. Why should the United States not accept this? Why can't it also have with Venezuela a relationship based on cooperation and respect? Because clearly they're trying to destroy instead a so-called narco-terrorist state. But what they are acting on, what are the fundamental issues regarding Venezuela, which is oil wealth, which is enormous. Now, this is clearly something which is damning to Venezuela, because a country that was a oil colony, and to not be an oil colony anymore, it has to face what the country that was a principal beneficiary of this in its supply of oil over decades and decades and decades. And when they start to charge a fair price, there you have this reaction, this intolerance, which is extremely dangerous, because the concentration of warships of an aircraft carrier, the largest aircraft carrier that exists, in fact, to try to recover what the United States did many times in the past, such as Panama, kidnapping the president of that country before, which it has done in other cases, killing, for example, the president of Iraq without any trial whatsoever, killing the president of Libya with no trial whatsoever. This leads us to think the worst could happen. Therefore, the importance of this kind of a roundtable is extremely important. Further, to be able to awaken other countries, such as the government in Brazil. Brazil has always had, because of its military doctrine, in fact, even in the undemocratic era, was concerned with to not have any connection to any fights and wars in South America, and at the same time to look for cooperation with Africa, not just the Portuguese-speaking African nations, but all of Africa. And that is a policy which is we've had since the government of Geisel, to try to have close relations with Angola, with Mozambique, with Guinea, with and where Brazil, with its engineering and other companies, constructed the infrastructure to always look for a broad relationship with all countries of the third world. This is very positive in Brazil. And now Brazil is extremely concerned about what is happening. That's why President Lula traveled to the ECLA, to the CELAC meeting in the middle of COP30. Lula understood the importance that this matter, this issue had, this danger of a military force being used in the Caribbean. This is still hanging over us as a shadow, as a threat. And President Lula went to the CELAC meeting precisely in order to send a message to the world, especially to the United States, that the use of force, of military force, must be set aside, since President Lula has been a kind of mediator because he's trying to have a relationship to try to resolve various trade questions, tariff questions, but he offers himself also as a mediator because he knows that Latin America cannot tolerate any sort of a military intervention. A direct military intervention could explode throughout the entire region, because that would mean, should there be such an intervention, and I hope that this does not happen, that this not occur, then we would have on our hands a military presence in the Amazonic region of the continent, in full knowledge of the fact that Venezuela is a member of the Amazon Treaty. There are 8 countries that are part of that treaty agreement. There has always been in Brazilian military doctrine a view of defending its sovereignty and the sovereignty in the Amazon, and to seek development of the immense wealth, and they have their niobium of water and others, in order to achieve development for the whole region, but for the entire region. This is a position which would be made unviable if there were to be a military conflagration based on a unilateral military aggression, because Venezuela is not provoking this. Venezuela is not the aggressor. Venezuela is not challenging the United States, but it is being threatened because it was totally arbitrary by Obama for him to make a decision that Venezuela was a threat when it never was such a threat. And again, I repeat, it never stopped supplying the United States with oil, since the United States was the largest consumer of oil in the world, and it has needs to find relationships outside its country in order to sustain its internal demand for oil and other energy, but not based on gunboat diplomacy, but on the basis of relationships of respect, relationship based on trust based. It would much be better if it were a cooperative relationship. But we all know that the spirit of the Monroe Doctrine is still hangs over us like a shadow, and it is in some of the heads in the White House. We hope that the attitude that President Trump brought to a dialogue with Vladimir Putin would be a motive for some sort of hope, because that dialogue didn't occur in the previous government of Joe Biden. There were immense problems to U.S. to dialogue with the Russian Federation, and to dialogue with Russia, to dialogue with China, dialogue with the BRICS, dialogue with CELAC. That, in fact, would be the answer and the solution for the United States to be able to have not only a policy that would be positive for the Caribbean, but also an internal policy of reconstruction of its own dynamic industrial capabilities in order to be able to pay off the enormous social debt which still exists within the United States as well. That's not resolved with war. That's settled with a policy, a democratic policy, and in fact, internally inside the United States. Thank you very much. It was an honor to be with you, participate with you.
And thank you very much, Mr. Almeida. You've just heard Beto Almeida, one of the founders of the Telesur TV network, headquartered in Caracas, Venezuela, and a member of the advisory board of the Brazilian Press Association. He spoke to us from Rio. Now we're going to hear from Dennis Small, Ibero-American editor of Executive Intelligence Review, speaking to us from Washington, D.C.
Okay, I switched off interpreter. I hope I'm on the right channel here.
Yep, you seem to be.
Okay, very good. Okay, let me begin before getting into the issue of the positive policy that's required, because it is not enough to simply say, President Trump, don't do it. We have to say what should be done, as Beto Almeida just emphasized so importantly. But let's just be clear. This does not have anything to do with drugs. Drugs is a $1 trillion yearly business run by an international cartel, which we have called Dope Incorporated. It's not the Kali cartel. It's not the Sinaloa cartel. It is the City of London and Wall Street financial cartel. It's $1 trillion a year. It's the major banks. If you want to stop drugs, you have to stop drug money laundering, which is at the heart of the whole thing. Secondly, just the basic facts. The amount of drugs that flow from Venezuela, as previous speakers have indicated, are not the problem. The flow of drugs into the United States, this is a map produced by the UNODC, the United Nations Organization for Drugs and Crime. It is the international grouping. The DEA statistics indicate the same thing, that looking at the trafficking of cocaine, which is the main drug trafficked from the Andean countries to the United States, 74% goes through the Eastern Pacific vector into Mexico, a very small percentage, 8% from Venezuela. Do some drugs leave from Venezuela? Of course. There's not a country in the world where this doesn't happen, but that is not the problem. And in case you think that this is an old map, here's the latest one, 2024. This indicates, although I don't have the numbers here, this does indicate from the UNDC as well what we're talking about. So it's all nonsense to talk about the drug problem in that way. Second point on drugs. Most of the drugs do not enter the United States by illegal migrants swimming across the Rio Grande or by fast boats dashing across the Caribbean. It's not true. According to the DEA's own statistics and CBP, the Customs and Border Patrol, 90% of the heroin seized coming into the United States, 88% of the cocaine seized coming into the United States, and 84% of the methamphetamine, coming into the United States comes across the official border crossings, the ports of entry, in trailers, in buses, in trucks, in cars, in big rigs. Those are the official reports from the DEA itself. So it's certainly not drugs. I would also like to simply state that I don't think that the issue is primarily oil. It is an issue, but it's a secondary issue. They definitely would like to have control of Venezuela's oil, not even so much to use it, but to securitize it as the basis for a new financial bubble. And the best example of that was stated explicitly by Maria Corina Machado, the so-called Nobel Peace Prize winner, who is slated, if there is an invasion and Narco Rubio has his way, to be the next president of Venezuela. She stated in an article yesterday in The Economist magazine of London, hey, we have $1.7 trillion of wealth in Venezuela that could help you guys over a 15-year period. And this has already led to a rally of Venezuelan bonds on the international markets with the expectation that the Gerald Ford aircraft carrier will help bail out the crashing bond market. And I think that's where the oil question really lies. What's the real issue here? The real issue is not what is happening in Venezuela per se, or in Caracas, but the real issue is located what's happening at a distance of 1,675 miles to the south. That's 2,700 kilometers. And that is, as previously mentioned, the construction of the Chancay port in Peru by Peru and China working together, which is the most modern megaport on the entire American Pacific coast, Long Beach included, which can handle the very largest of container ships in the world, 24,000 TEUs, and the distance and the cost of direct shipping now from Peru and through that the rest of South America over to Shanghai and China has been reduced by 10 to 15%. The only thing that will actually work with the Shanghai port to function fully is the construction of the bioceanic corridor over the South American landmass from the Atlantic to the Pacific, at this point being discussed from the Brazilian port of Ilhéus across the Amazon region and into Shanghai, which would open up the entire region. This is the BRICS. This is the Belt and Road Initiative. This is what every single country in South America, its populations, absolutely need. And it is not a threat to the United States or shouldn't be conceived as such. And yet the statements from policymakers in the neoconservative crowd and in London in particular with regard to this matter is one of absolute terror and fear. It is foreign affairs, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche stated. It's also the explicit statements of Admiral Halsey of the Southern Command, of Laura Richardson, formerly of the Southern Command, of Evan Ellis, the National Defense University expert, the Atlantic Council. They all say, our strategic objective is China must be expelled from the Western Hemisphere because it is a war danger to the United States. And this is what the actual issue is in Venezuela here. Now, what needs to be done? Well, let's go back up by 1,675 miles and look at what the potential is of the Caribbean basin. Now, I only have time to give you just a real bare sketch of the potential here, but I want you to look at three aspects of this map, which EIR produced a number of years ago, to show what the possibilities are for cooperation and development of the entire Caribbean basin. That includes Venezuela. That includes Brazil. It includes Guyana. It includes Cuba. It includes Mexico. And it includes the United States of America, which is in the Caribbean basin. Look at the rail routes. These lines that you can see here, the green ones are the ones that exist. Many of them pretty shabby, but they do exist. What need to be constructed are further rail connections across the entire northern route of South America, connecting through French Guiana, through Suriname, into Guyana, into Venezuela, and so on, then across through the Darien Gap to build high-speed rail connections, as the Chinese have already agreed to do with Panama, all the way up through into Mexico, across the United States, Canada, and then through the Bering Strait Tunnel, which is in fact the centerpiece of what a proper relationship is between the United States and Russia, as was raised at the Alaska meetings. That's one thing to consider here. Massive rail reconstruction needed in the United States as well. As Beto Almeida was saying, we have to get back to our own industrial reconstruction. Second, look at the blue dotted lines. These are the maritime sea routes of the Silk Road. What needs to be done is not only through the the Panama Canal, which has been expanded, but the Nicaraguan Canal, a sea level canal, is absolutely necessary for expanded trade. This will help build up the entire region along with the rail routes so that the people in these areas like Central America and Mexico can have a life to live, so that they have development, so we end poverty, so that they're not driven into the waiting arms of the drug trade, also run through Wall Street, and have no need to migrate. If you want to stop migration, if you want to stop the drug problem, which are very real problems in the United States, develop, bring industrial development to these regions. And so this maritime sea route is extremely important. We have one route here from São Luís, which is important because that's near the Carajás iron ore mine in Brazil through this region. But also we propose the development of major deep water industrial ports in Ponce, Puerto Rico, where there are already plans for the same, very advantageous for the United States since Puerto Rico is part of the United States, and this can be connected into the ports in the US. In Mariel, Cuba, proposed by the Cuban government. They have an entire development plan for Cuba. It's in our interest in the United States for that to occur, especially because the transshipment then to ports like New Orleans and others is facilitated. And we would urge that the same be done in the port of Fort Liberté in northern Haiti to save that country from the kind of Gaza process which it has been going on for decades, if not centuries. That's the second element. The third and final element I want to point out is these stars that I've placed on the map, one in Alcântara in Brazil and the second in Kourou in French Guiana. These are the space launch centers. Kourou is for the European Union. Alcântara has been the location in Brazil where advanced technologies in this area were carried out. It has now become diminished. These centers must be developed with the most advanced technologies among other regions for the purpose of training of manpower, developing skilled labor so that the labor force of the continent, of this entire region, are not simply producing raw materials for export, functioning as slave labor, but so that they can achieve maximum development with a standard of living worthy of human beings and where you can have advanced science and technology available to the entire population. I end by emphasizing one central point. President Trump, not only don't do that, do this. This policy of the United States working with China, of the United States working with Russia, of the United States working with the ideas presented by Pope Leo XIV in his recent discussion of Nicholas of Cusa, which I will leave to the discussion period, work with Ibero-America to develop these kinds of processes, and the United States will once again return to its true roots of the American Revolution against the British colonial policy, and we will find throughout the world cheering support and cooperation around the world. The only unhappy people will be the Wall Street crowd, the City of London crowd, the people who are actually behind Jeffrey Epstein. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dennis. And before we go to our commentary on today's presentations, we want to ask Executive Intelligence Review's Editor-in-Chief, Helga Sutler-Baruch, if there's anything she'd like to say prior to us doing that.
Well, I think that if emanating from this panel discussion, we could ignite in all of Latin America and Central America a discussion about what Dennis just presented, I think we could turn a big crisis into a big chance, because it is very clear that the global majority, which represents 85% of the human population, are moving exactly in this direction of a new paradigm. And I have said this before, but I think we have reached a branching point in human history where if we continue geopolitics, which led to 2 world wars in the 20th century, we could annihilate the entire existence of our species. If, on the other side, we would elevate the relations among nations to the idea humanity first, which has been expressed by President Xi Jinping many times when he talks about the shared community of the one future of humanity. If we can mobilize forces to think that way first, all problems can be solved. And I would really wish that, maybe we can mobilize people to speak out. I think President Ramotha lamented the fact that governments are not speaking out and other forces are not speaking out. If we could cause a whole debate among media, among government officials, among other organizations in Latin America, demanding this kind of cooperation and, basically saying the conflict can be solved by having Russia, especially China, and the United States work together on the realization of these projects, I think we could turn the tide dramatically.
Thank you, Helga. And we realize other members of the roundtable may also have comments, but what we're going to do is to first go to a few people who are responding today to today's speakers, the first of which is Mirella Barreto Lopez. She is a Venezuelan diplomat and historian. She's speaking today in a private capacity only. She speaks to us from Caracas, Venezuela. And please.
Buenas tardes, buenos días, buenas noches.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. It's an honor to participate in this symposium with this group of people from all different parts of the world. In first case, in particular, I am thankful to the Schiller Institute and to Helga Sepp-LaRouche for this opportunity about this dialogue, which is so important in this moment where we have a very difficult situation that my country, Venezuela, lives because of the policies, political and military policies. And I am, me as Venezuelan, I am grateful to all of you that are calling attention that we have a situation where we have a country that is an aggressor and a victim, another country that is a victim. Secondly, I want to thank President Ramotar, because I think he presented and put in place the many elements of the situation, geopolitical situation of Latin America and of Venezuela, because Guyana, we had a situation with Guyana before. So this situation that has been, we have these accusations against President Nicolas Maduro, saying that he is behind the production and trade of drugs. And they spoke about some narco group, the cartel of the soles, that is not even, it doesn't even exist. And this is being said in order to attack a country. And that is when in reality, the interest of the United States in Venezuela is a change of regime change policy. And so we have a government led by President Trump that is against a government that has been dedicated since the Bolivarian Revolution to defend the rights of a nation and of its right to development. And according to our constitution, and we have a constitution of the Revolutionary Republic of Venezuela that has been approved with the population approved this constitution in elections, and that constitution establishes, among other points, something from my standpoint is very important, and is not even mentioned, and they don't forgive us as a country, and that is the development of democracy and with participation of the population in our Venezuela, in our country. We had traditionally the liberal democracy, and but now we have a right, a constant right, a permanent of taking decisions for our development. And that possibility of development ourselves, this next Sunday, we will have elections, popular elections again. We have forgotten the number of elections we have had in Venezuela, but this election that is happening next Sunday, 26th, is in order to decide the development projects in 5 communities if they will allow development in their own territory. And that's democracy. That is our democracy. The President Maduro is always saying that is to look for more democracy. We have deputies in the National Assembly that have been elected democratically in the country. We might say that characteristics of our development is part of what we are not forgiven. It is what is not being forgiven by United States on Venezuela. We are an example for the population, the world population, and in particular for Latin American population, that we want to relate with the world, what we call the diplomacy, the Bolivarian diplomacy of the country. We have a collaboration, and we ask for respect for development and our right as a nation to integrate all our community, which is Latin America, which is the Caribbean. We are not the neighborhood of anybody, and much less of United States, because in addition, in that situation, we consider. So we have a fight between two visions. We have the Monroe Doctrine and the doctrine of Simón Bolívar. And we shouldn't forget that the Monroe Doctrine that was said America for Americans, but what were they talking about? North Americans. And that's the vision that the White House has, and the vision, our vision in our country, in Bolivarian, since 1823, is a declaration by Simón Bolívar. The United States are destined by providence to plague America of hunger and misery. And that's what Bolívar said in that period, which is different to the Monroe Doctrine, which wants all the Western Hemisphere. But we are a nation, a sovereign nation. We have the right, as every country, to our own development and to the autodetermination of our development. And we want to be respected by all the countries in the world. And lastly, I am very happy with the words from the Schiller Institute and Mr. Ramotar and our colleagues and our friends. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well, Senor Lopez. This is Morella Barreto Lopez, Venezuelan historian and diplomat, speaking in a private capacity to us from Caracas, Venezuela. And now to also comment, we have Diane Sayre, a former candidate for United States Senate from the state of New York, and she speaks to us from the New York City area.
Can I be heard okay?
Yes.
My video is slow. Okay. Yeah. So I just wanted to perhaps create a little perspective and give people some insight into the dynamic in the United States. We are coming up to the 250th anniversary of the American Declaration of Independence, our war of independence against the British colonial system. And those who want to perpetuate that policy have never forgiven our nation for that. And it is my opinion, informed opinion, that they would like nothing better than to make the American president, Donald Trump, using his particular personality flaws, his narcissistic ego and confusion, New York real estate mafia approach to diplomacy, to be not merely his undoing, but the undoing of the United States itself. And we have right now a divide between two directions of the world, which is the global majority, which is establishing a new paradigm of relations among nations based on mutual respect for sovereignty, security, and human dignity. And we have the leftover residue of this British imperial system today, as Dennis Small said, typified not so much by national identities, but by a club of billionaires who frankly would prefer to eliminate the nation state altogether. Now, if you think about the likelihood of the United States succeeding, whatever that means, in a war on Venezuela, consider that the United States just a few months ago could not even defeat the Houthi rebels in Yemen. And President Trump extricated himself from that by claiming that we had won a great victory and that they were just surrendering. This, frankly, was a great humiliation. If you look at what Helga Zepp-LaRouche identified early on, the way that Trump is being induced to obliterate his own base, in a sense as if someone were manipulating King Lear to expel the one daughter, Cordelia, who was telling him the truth, as Marjorie Taylor Greene typifies the Trump base, saying, we elected you to not carry out perpetual wars, to not spend billions of dollars overseas, but to address the problems the American people are suffering. My 3 children cannot afford to buy a house. People cannot afford groceries. We want this to be solved. And she has overwhelming support. President Trump has called her a traitor. This has caused a series of death threats and a security situation against her. And when President Trump was asked about it, he said, she's not in any danger and nobody's listening to her anyways. Very dangerous remarks. So I think that, one, it has to be made very, very clear to the president by an adult, which is very hard because of this narcissism problem, he prefers to surround himself with sycophants who will not tell him the truth, that the Venezuela military adventure will be a complete disaster. It is not going to make us look stronger. It is not going to be a quick victory. It will result in massive bloodshed and unintended consequences, and that he is actually being induced to destroy himself, his legacy, and anything the United States might have represented. Because as Dennis Small outlined in his the positive program, under the American system, our government actually has the power to regulate Wall Street, to bankrupt Wall Street, as Lyndon LaRouche said, and to put an end to this speculative madness, which is about to crash around our heads right now. So I will leave my comments at that.
Thank you very much, Diane. And I understand Dennis Small wants to both make an announcement and make a comment. So, Dennis?
Well, for starters, I'll just make an announcement, which is I heard from Celeste Sáenz of the Journalists Club of Mexico, who is expected to join us. She is on her way. She had a medical issue she had to take care of. She sends her apologies and hopefully will be joining us shortly. So I'll just say that for now, and let's proceed, Dennis.
Okay, very good. So what I'd like to do, we have, I think, everybody now from the roundtable up on screen. And so I think what the idea should be, I mean, I'm sure everybody has plenty to say. And when we have Celeste here, we'll let her, of course, make her comments. So let me simply ask, anybody would like to raise their hand and speak first. I know one person wants to speak, but I don't know about others. Ray is being shy. Dennis, let's go. Oh, he put his hand up. There he goes. Please.
Who are we going to, me or Ray?
We're going to Ray. Put his hand up.
Fast trigger hand. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Ray.
Can I be heard?
You're fine.
Again, okay. I should defer to those who know a lot more about Venezuela and this particular issue. But I have a personal thing to share. I don't know if any of you have shaken the hand of Nicolas Maduro, but I have. It was in May of this year. I was with one of his former diplomats in Moscow, and I got a chance to be introduced to Maduro. Now, suffice it to say that his hand is about twice the size of mine, and mine is a reasonably big hand, okay? His presence is imposing, intimidating even. He is so large and so commanding with his presence. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that for me, the only thing against Nicolas Maduro from the U.S. point of view is that he didn't go to Harvard and he didn't go to Yale and he didn't spend a lot of time in the United States preparing him to be a ruler of a kind of a satrap organization. And he doesn't polish his shoes as well as many other people, okay? Now, is he an economist? No, he's not a PhD in economist. But if you look at the U.S. sanctions, I mean, I doubt that anyone could have done as well as Maduro has done under those pressures. What I'm saying here is that there's a big hand here. Now, this hand could fall. Next time the U.S. tries to assassinate Maduro, let's remember that he was giving a speech in the outdoors and he was attacked by drones just a couple of years ago. They missed, thankfully, for Maduro and for the Venezuelan people, I would say. But if he is assassinated, there's a very big Bolivarian hand in the Venezuelan people. Simón Bolívar lives, okay? And that will be demonstrated, in my view. Trump needs to know that because the Bolivarian people will say, sí, se puede, and the U.S. will suffer yet another imperial defeat. That's all I wanted to say. It's a big hand. It's the hand of Simón Bolívar, and we should make sure that if we have any way of telling our policymakers that the Venezuelan people have that big hand. That's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. All right, anyone else? Oh, Dennis,
Yeah.
did you want to comment? I think.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I have not had the pleasure of shaking Nicolas Maduro's hand, but I've shaken Ray McGovern's hand. So that's something. A number of people have asked, including in the question chat here, are they really that crazy to do something like this? And I think the answer is that that's not the correct question. The question is, are they that desperate? And I think the answer to that question is yes. I'm not forecasting that there will be an invasion. I'm simply saying they are extraordinarily desperate because they are facing the bankruptcy collapse of the entire transatlantic system with $2 quadrillion of speculative assets. And people always say, how much is that? It's a 2 followed by 15 zeros. It's a lot. It can't be paid. It's a speculative bubble. And everything they're doing is designed to try to maintain that system. Back in 2012, the U.S. Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations released a 335-page case history report on a bank called HSBC, Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. And they found them and documented that they had been involved up to their eyeballs in laundering drug money from the Sinaloa cartel. That's just a small part of it. The entire financial system is addicted to drug money, as Antonio Maria Costa, the former head of the UN ODC, has said, and others as well. And in fact, when the Obama's Attorney General, Eric Holder, was asked about this, why don't you impose sanctions on these drug banks? And he said in a written letter to congressmen, no, we can't do that, or the entire financial system would come crashing down. That's known as the Holder Doctrine, or the Holder Letter. They cannot go after this. They not only can't go after it, they don't want to go after it because the entire system depends on it. Panama is often mentioned as an example of how easy it would be to decapitate Venezuela and put in a head of state as they did with Panama. People might want to recall that when Noriega was removed by Bush, one of the role models of Marco Rubio, the person that they put in was Guillermo Endara. Endara, who was fondly known in Panama as Porky Endara because of his girth, was a joint owner of the Banco Interoceánico with a gentleman by the name of Rodriguez Gacha, one of the Cali cartel top bankers. So the president that was installed in Panama after the invasion was a drug runner, and they knew it. And one could almost argue that's why they did it. So it's not a question of, are they that crazy? They are, but they're that desperate, and it has to do with the financial system. Now, I have to take up one other point, which is this issue of the Monroe Doctrine. I think people, especially in Latin America, but also in the United States, should be more precise, because what they are referring to, or should be referring to, is the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, the Teddy Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which was declared in 1905 by President Teddy Roosevelt to justify military intervention throughout the region. The original Monroe Doctrine was the exact opposite. And I say this because it is not only historically important, it is crucial to understand the nature of the United States and the possibilities for changing this policy. The Monroe Doctrine was not written by President Monroe in 1823. It was written by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who went on to become the 6th President of the United States. John Quincy Adams was, among other things, one of the most avid opponents of slavery, goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. And we should not do this because we might become the dictatress of the world. She would no longer be the ruler of her own spirit. What Monroe, through John Quincy Adams, was saying is British colonialism must be expelled from the region, and American countries had the right to sovereignty and their own defense. That was John Quincy Adams' policy. The most significant first time the actual Monroe Doctrine was applied, and I'll bet most people on this call don't know this, was in defense of Benito Juarez in Mexico against the Emperor Maximilian of Habsburg. And it was applied by Andrew Johnson right after Lincoln had been assassinated, but was in the Lincoln tradition. and it was used to defend Mexico and a besieged president against a foreign invasion. So I agree with the criticisms of the policy of the big stick, but let's call it by its proper name of the Roosevelt corollary, because the opposite policy of John Quincy Adams is exactly the policy which we think the United States should return to today.
Okay. Did we ever hear from Celeste, by the way? Nothing yet? Okay, fine.
I'll advise you, not yet.
All right, very good. President Ramatar, you have anything you'd like to contribute at this point?
Not at the moment. Not at the moment. I would prefer to listen a little bit more.
Okay, very good. Anybody want to either respond to what was just said or have anything else they'd like to bring up at this moment?
I could add some rhyming to what Dennis has been saying. Sorry, disculpa, Beto. Because I just jumped in without too much consideration. But you know, the other time that Venezuela was threatened by a Navy buildup was in 1902. And it was, in that case, if I'm not mistaken, it was French, Italian, and German ships. And it was to reclaim a debt for the current president at that moment, Cipriano Castro, which was basically after more than 50 years of civil war. It was a very complicated moment, and they were trying to pressure him in order to collect the debt. And Cipriano Castro, basically what he did was to release from prison all his political opponents and all the patriots and everything, and then everyone around the country to rally around the flag and defend the country. And it was by the way, it was the U.S. participation in that moment that also helped to back up the Europeans that were pressuring Venezuela. It wasn't, I don't think already that moment was already changing, was already shaping into precisely the Rooseveltian approach to Latin America. But anyway, it's funny enough that was the last time Venezuela had a Navy buildup in front of its shores. And now, well, this is the rhyming goes to this moment now, which is precisely the United States. And sometimes I even contest the idea that this has to do with the Roosevelt corollary. It's because in the sense it's so nihilistic. It goes beyond any kind of doctrine that I don't know how much it actually could even claim of that in that sense. Also, and I think this is also important, talking about Roosevelt, I think we have been, and this was also a neo-conist thing, we have seen up to this point, even up to Biden, that it was all about a Wilsonian approach to U.S. interests around the world. You always had these justifications about bringing, democracy and freedom throughout the world, and as one of the main missions of the United States. And now it doesn't matter anymore. Talking about that very same nihilism that we're talking about right now. And I think it also reflects on think tank land and the way they're actually analyzing the possibilities and threats regarding Venezuela. If you see it, the CSIS, one of the most recent reports, it's quite interesting how it's so mechanical and so automatic that it's frightening, the reassurance of what kind of military action, one person would have regarding Venezuela. But one thing, it's a common feat among all of this, which is they all mostly prefer and heavily rely on some sort of internal collapse as conquering by collapse, as using maximum pressure in order to make us do our own bidding for the United States. And I think, and that also shows how the psychological factor and the economic one also have like a major place in this at this moment, and how it's not actually working, I might add to this point. But if that doesn't work, which is, I think I'm positive that's the case up to this point, and that also might be the reason why Trump is accepting, I don't know how performative this is, the possibility of talk with the Venezuelan leadership. It will then amount, playing with hypothetical scenarios, to airstrikes or naval blockade, but no one has actually considered, not even the CSIS report, the possibility of an invasion, because they know how complicated and dangerous this could be and how a quagmire it can become. And of course, this doesn't rule out that threat in that given scenario, but I do think that it could be, all of this could be averted.
Okay.
I think that outlier, it's a possibility. Venezuela is an outlier. Latin America has been able to create worlds and to shape up other republics. Think about what the Venezuelan and the Gran Colombia independence did and influenced Italy, for example, Italy's Risorgimento, or the German reunification. Anyway, that was just trying to add up something else and not keeping quiet for too long.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Almeida. Yes, you had your hand up before, please. Yeah.
Yo me gustaría
I would like
acrescentar
to
algo.
present
Venezuela
something.
es el tercer
Venezuela
mayor
is the
fornecedor de
third
petróleo de Estados Unidos, a pesar de todas las
provider
sanciones.
of oil of the
Son
United States.
1044
Besides,
sanciones
it,
impuestas por Estados Unidos contra
it doesn't matter the
Venezuela.
sanctions.
Y hay
United
más,
States has imposed more
el
than
gobierno
1,000
Biden
sanctions.
redujo la
And besides,
expropiación
the
de
Biden
activos
government
venezolanos, la CITCO,
um,
y otras
expropriated
empresas
the
petroleras
Venezuelan
venezolanas en
investments
territorio
or
estadounidense.
deposits in United States.
O sea, hay una actitud
So there is an
bastante
attitude
vengativa, tal como
of revenge
hubo la expropiación, el
as the
confisco de las
expropriation
reservas de
and the
oro de
confiscation
Venezuela en
of the gold
bancos
reserves of Venezuela
ingleses.
in the British
De la misma
banks.
manera, en
In the same way,
1979,
in
los bancos ingleses han
1979, the British
expropiado,
banks expropriated
confiscado
or
las
confiscated
reservas
the reserves
de Irán que estaban
of
depositadas en
Iraq
Londres
that were
también. O
deposited
sea,
in
esas
London.
prácticas
So those
no
practices
impidieron el progreso de la
didn't
revolución iraní,
stop the
que hoy es un
progress of the
país que
Iranian
lanza
revolution,
naves
was the
al espacio
country
sideral,
that
que tiene
launches
desarrollo,
uh,
una política
um,
nacionalista del
to the
petróleo,
space, and it has a
propia, que ha
nationalistic
desarrollado
policy
toda
of
una
oil.
tecnología
It
de
has
defensa,
developed
pero
a
eso no
defense
impidió que
technology.
Donald Trump, sin
And
declarar
but
guerra,
Donald Trump,
ha
without declaring
bombardeado
war,
Irán por varios
bombed
días,
Iran during several days,
causando la
causing
muerte
the
de 1,000
death
personas. O sea,
of 1,000 people.
lo que
In other
quiero
words, what
subrayar
I want
es
to
el peligro
underline
que estamos
is the
viviendo de
danger
ataques
that
de
we
esa
have
naturaleza,
is of an
porque
attack
diferente sería
of
el
that
desembarco,
nature,
porque el
which
propio comandante Hugo
the
Chávez ya decía que
Chavez already
si
said
tropas
that
estadounidenses
U.S. troops
desembarcaran en Venezuela,
would
allí
come
se
to
transformaría en
Venezuela,
nuevo Vietnam,
and that
y
would
un
become a
Vietnam
new Vietnam,
latinoamericano, y un
a
momento
Latin
en que Estados
American
Unidos vive una
Vietnam,
crisis social muy
in a
grande,
moment where
muy
United States
grande.
is in a
Bueno,
social
si
crisis.
la idea de
So
Trump
the
era
idea of
recuperar
Trump
la
was
grandeza de
to
Estados Unidos, el MAGA,
make America great again with
debería
MAGA.
hacer
If his
como un
idea were
esfuerzo de
that,
pagar las
he
deudas
would
internas.
he should
Hay
try to
mitad de la
pay
población
the
estadounidense no
national
tiene
debt.
seguridad
Half
social, por
of the
ejemplo.
U.S. population
Hay
doesn't have
problemas de
social security
naturaleza
or security. There are
habitacional,
problems
hay
of
problemas
housing.
de deudas
There
en la
is
área
a
habitacional, las
debt, there are
universidades
school debts,
no se
student
pueden pagar.
debts in the
Y al mismo
universities that are
tiempo
not being
hay
paid.
una
And at the
política
same
en
time,
que
there is a
Estados Unidos
policy
tiene
in
unos
which
límites
United States
y el límite es la
has a limit,
existencia
and the
concreta de los
limit
BRICS.
is the
O sea,
insistence of the BRICS. In
la
other
Federación
words,
Rusa tiene una
the Russian
existencia sólida.
Federation has a solid
La República Popular de
existence.
China tiene
China
una existencia sólida. No
is
se puede,
is
tiene
is a
capacidad
solid
de defensa
country. It has the
tecnológica,
capacity
tiene
of
posibilidad
defense
incluso de proponer al
technology, and
mundo
it has the possibility
maneras
to propose the
alternativas de
world of
cooperación y lo está
alternative
haciendo,
ways of
con grande
cooperation,
posibilidad de
which
que
already
en
is
América
doing, with
Latina
the
tenga cada vez
possibility
más
of
éxito,
Latin
cada vez
America to
más
have
ímpetu. El
to be
puerto de
able to do that.
Chancay, en Perú,
The
es apenas
Shanghai
una
port
idea
is
de lo
only
que
an
puede pasar.
idea of what can be done.
Entonces, el mundo
So the world is intending, is making the attempt, or several countries, to integrate, as is the case for the Latin American policy, to come back to the policy of Ibero-American integration, which was sponsored by Hugo Chavez, Lula, Dilma Rousseff, Nestor Kirchner. There were some advances and backwards. And there was the proposal to build the Mariel port to use the regional commerce in the Caribbean to be a productive revolution inside the Cuban Revolution, to have commerce and trade that could change the North American policy. The U.S. wanted to integrate in a certain way and have some American business participation from the United States. And so the United States and its policy to Cuba, Nicaragua, Asia could be changed. But in the other hand, there is the idea of the Latin American integration that has a very good image and is welcome not only for Russia, China, and Iran, and several other BRICS countries that they want to integrate Latin America into BRICS, not only Venezuela. The mistake by the Brazilian government was not accepting Venezuela to BRICS, and that has to be overcome. The idea that we have here is that we will have a correction, and there is a correction happening, because the integration idea is what can give progress to Latin America. As Juan Domingo Perón said, when the 21st century will find us united or divided. But the big question is, what would United States want to do to maintain a war policy, as Marco Rubio, for example, wants to do, or the military industrial complex, or that could have a situation when they supported the Maidan coup in Ukraine, and that led us to the destruction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That's a policy of destruction. The European countries have been under the United States, and we can see Germany, which was the motor of the economy in Europe, and right now is going down. So the world should consider that BRICS exists and is open to cooperation. The alternative is a sinister alternative of war. United States wants to recuperate the the United States economy. The U.S. should go back to the independence, or it will continue this sinister policy to looking for a war. So they have a choice, but we need to choose the integration line. And so that's the challenge to all the thinkers and the forces, that there are some forces inside the United States. It's a complex issue, but Jack London wasn't alone. He represented a profound thinking, and he had followers, and that thinking still exists inside the United States.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else have any comments? I wondered, and I also should just indicate to both Morella Lopez and also Diane Sayre, if you have anything else, please raise it sometime in the next 5 minutes or 10 minutes or so, because we're going to conclude at 1:30. I'm going to give everybody on the panel the chance to make final remarks. But does anybody have anything to say at this point? Oh, Diane has something. Okay, we go to Diane Sayre.
I hope I can be heard. I think this point that has now been made by several people about the idea of inducing a nation, inducing someone to destroy themselves is very important, and we should consider that. I also just wanted to say for the record that we should actually consider the next 250 years of the United States and of mankind as a whole, because I think the natural impulse of human beings is to be better. It is very unnatural for people to kill each other and engage in such conflict and inflicting suffering on other people. And I think that's our strength. And I'm sure Helga, who is the master of this concept, will have much more to say about it. But I also think that it is very urgent. It is very to here in the United States, I will say there is a sense of great instability, of people feeling bombarded and abused by the extremism of the invectives on all sides, and therefore a beautiful idea of mankind and the solutions to the crisis is urgently necessary. And I just wanted to express my gratitude and thanks to everyone participating in the panel, and particularly Helga Zeppler-Rouche for her work on these matters and the coincidence of opposites. That's it.
Okay, very good. Yes, Morella Barreto Lopez, you wanted to say something?
Sí, solo comentar
Yes, I
esta
wanted to comment
posibilidad de que el mundo nos
about this
pueda ver
possibility of the
de una
world,
manera directa, que podamos
that the
conocer la
world can
verdad,
see
la verdad
and
de
know
Venezuela,
the truth of
dejando
Venezuela,
de lado todo ese filtro y todas esas
putting
acusaciones que se hacen
aside all the
falsas que se
accusations
hace contra nuestro país.
that
Y
are being made
efectivamente,
against our country,
estrechar lazos, un poco la
and
idea de lo que
also
decía
to
la
extend
señora
our
Zeppler-Rouge,
hands
que esto
to Mrs. Helga
sea la
Zeppler-Rouche,
primera oportunidad para
and
discutir
we are
más
grateful for the
adelante y más
opportunity she gave
profundamente
us.
lo que
So
pasa en
later
particular
on,
en mi país.
we
Creo
can
que
continue
Venezuela,
this
esta es una
discussion
oportunidad
in
para
our
que
country.
Venezuela sea
And
vista y escuchada
this is an opportunity for
agradecemos.
Venezuela to be known and heard in the world. And thank you. Thank you very much.
Much. So I think what we'll do, if there are no other comments, is to begin going to final remarks. So why don't we start with President Ramotar? He has the seniority here, other than Ray McGovern, but that's a different matter. We don't want to have any kind of gringo imperialism here. So let's go with Ramotar.
I don't consider myself the senior. I think it's very good that we've had this discussion, and I think it needs to continue. And because the world is facing two possibilities. One, that we can descend into great destruction. And on the other hand, there are possibilities that are developing now that can make us move forward and conquer many of the challenges that we face. Not only the challenges with war and peace, not only with these kind of regime change that America seems, the United States right-wing forces, the elite forces seems to constantly be playing with. But we have possibilities of other things. Even in the United States itself, I believe there's some deep-going changes taking place. And the elections recently in New York of Mamdani, I think is a very significant event. It shows that what one time you couldn't say the word socialism in the United States, and you would have been kicked out of any company that you were in. But now, even though they're talking about democratic socialism, it is a concept that is now being more and more accepted. It might not be to everybody's standard that they want, but I think it's a great step forward. And I detect a lot of changes taking place in the United States. In the little that I can follow, I follow some of the big meetings that are being held by the Democratic Socialist there. And I think that tells me that there's a change in the thinking taking place that is very important for international relations and for the safety of the world, that more and more American people are coming around to the position that forever wars is not in their interest and cooperation is more in their interest. And that cooperation is being held out constantly by the BRICS country, particularly by China, who constantly promotes peace. And they are practically ignoring threats, and while they're standing firm on it and retaliate in kind when they have to, but they are constantly promoting peace and showing the possibility of what peace can do. And China itself needs peace more than probably anywhere else because of the rapid development that is taking place there, and the example that they are offering that another way is possible for a more just world. The very fact that they are the only country that have abolished absolute poverty is by itself a great achievement for us. But I believe that for us, what we have to constantly do is to try to get mass participation more and more in our politics and to encourage more and more international solidarity. Very often we are trapped in our own cocoon and in our own problems, and not necessarily always seeing that our problems are not confined to us, that we're not an island to ourselves, but that our problems are part of the international problem, and the solution are part of the international solution that we have. And that is why I put a lot of store in international solidarity and trying to raise the consciousness of people all over the world that this is our salvation. We cannot just leave our destiny in the hands of elected or governments for that matter, but we have to have the participation of the people. That, to my mind, what will be important in bringing about the positive changes that I think we all seek. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Ramatar. And now we'll go to the Yankee, Ray McGovern. But you might be a Dodgers man, actually, but I'll let you go.
Can I be heard?
Yes, you can be heard.
Okay, good.
Loud and clear.
Well, thanks for letting this gringo participate. I'd like to emphasize the fact that my ancestors were refugees, undocumented refugees that came to America because of economic disasters in Europe, in my case, in Ireland. So my perspective is kind of formed by that as I look at my colleagues here who come out of a different perspective, and I'm probably the oldest guy on this seminar, far older than President Ramatar. So I'm going to go back into history again, not 5 decades. Let's try 5 centuries. A fellow named Christopher Columbus, who was virtually a saint when I was studying history. He discovered America, and he spent the next 2 decades trying to figure a way around it or through it because he was trying to get somebody else, right? But in the process, he landed on a bunch of islands, and the only part of the mainland that he landed on in the Western Hemisphere was Venezuela. Now, maybe that's why President Trump has rehabilitated Columbus. So he was a good guy. He didn't spread syphilis and slavery and all these. No, Christopher Columbus is good. Well, you know, if you look at it from my perspective, I was taught that this was a good thing. Of course, I'm old enough now to realize it was a very bad thing. So let me close with something that comes in the nature of a warning to us to be very serious about this, but not to take ourselves too seriously. Here's a little apocryphal story. The year is 1492. A native chieftain is on top of a hill overlooking the Caribbean, and he sees these three sailboats come in, and one of them, the smallest one, comes up on the beach, and a fella comes out in glorious gold and red and all kinds of colors, and he lands on the beach. And the chief is looking at this, and so is his aide-de-camp, the chief of staff. And this fellow who lands on the beach says, "Buenos dias." And the chief of staff says to the chief, "Oh, damn, there goes our neighborhood." Sorry about that, but there's a kind of I think there's a metaphor there. Sorry about what us gringos did to your neighborhood. Maybe we can do better in the future. Meanwhile, sí, se puede.
All right. Okay. Mr. Almeida, let's go to you. Let's hear from Brazil.
Sí. Bueno, hubo un tiempo
During a time, a president of United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had a cooperation policy with the government of Getúlio Vargas in Brazil. Besides the labor policies and nationalist policies in Brazil, there was an investment, a great investment of United States in order to create the metal industry in Brazil, the base of all industrialization in Brazil. And that was done through a cooperation between Roosevelt and Getúlio Vargas. And it was the result happened that there was a political alliance, not only economic alliance, but also like a political alliance. The fight against Nazism. Brazil sent troops, was probably the only country in Latin America that went to fight against Nazis in Europe. And there was a military base in the northeast Brazil. It was for the United States the fastest way for North America, for the US and Brazil to go to Europe. That cooperation, when the son of Franklin Roosevelt told the son of Vargas, because Roosevelt was very sick, he knew he was going to die, he sent a message to Getúlio that when he would die, would be a coup d'etat, and that's what happened in 1954. But it's clear, with a suicide that created chaos in Getúlio Vargas in Brazil, created a havoc. And it happened until 1964, when actually happened a coup d'etat where there was a dictatorship, a pro-American dictatorship, because the population defeated the coup that caused the death of Getulio Vargas. So what we see, there are situations where with the development of, we had help for the metal industry, which was the base for the industrialization of Brazil. And it happened through the cooperation. Of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had another perspective, another policy, the Great Agreement, which was a policy that was attacked, the Great Deal, because Roosevelt had, there were people who like socialism, but there was the development of nuclear energy, but there was the Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the wars that happened. So we have to think, because of the destructive capacity has been developed in such a way without limits, which makes that the forces of progress, the forces of civilization, want to develop a cooperation above even situations. But that represents mainly to respect of the sovereignty of the countries like Venezuela, and also respect their election, like the Bolivarian election and its policies, because Venezuela has never had attack or boycotted, has never boycotted United States. It has been providing oil to the United States. So that's an example that can be used in order to show how we must find ways of respect, not intervention, and see what happened when Lula violated the Brazilian constitution and intervened in Venezuelan internal issues. But the constitution of Brazil prohibits to do that. And it seems that there is a correction, and that correction starts with the recuperation of the Ibero-American integration. So it's important to see the role of Lula as a mediator, because he has a dialogue with the United States, and also so he has a dialogue with Venezuela, and to promote, he is president of BRICS, and that is symbolically important to find a way out to stop, to prevent the use of military force in the Caribbean.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Dennis?
Never underestimate the capabilities of a good trade union organizer, whether that be in Brazil or in Guyana, or in the United States for that matter. I have 2 points I want to make on the subject of integration that Beto just repeated and stated before. In 2002, to be specific, June 12th, 2002, Lyndon and Helga LaRouche were invited to Brazil for a series of meetings. One in particular was Lyndon LaRouche was given the honorary keys to the city of Sao Paulo, Brazil. And in one of his numerous speeches in Brazil, he began by saying, "We must either sail together or we will sink together." And I think that is equally true today as it was then. The historical example that was cited, and I believe it was Diego, if I'm not mistaken, to fill out the picture around the Roosevelt corollary with the debt collection expedition of the Germans, the French, and so on into the Americas, which is the whole approach of the Roosevelt corollary. It is of enormous historic significance for all of Latin America, as well as the world, that the doctrinal opposition to this debt collection was expressed by the foreign minister of Argentina, whose name was Luis Maria Drago. This became known as the Drago Doctrine, the Drago Doctrine, which stated very simply, it prohibited the use of military force to collect the debt. Now, this should give non-Latin Americans a sense of the historic depth and background of the issues that we're actually facing here in Venezuela, just as our Latin American friends understand the depth of the actual historical issues in the United States. Just think through what Beto just said about FDR and his role in, and it wasn't just in Brazil, it was in Mexico too. FDR is the person who allowed and strengthened Mexico to be able to nationalize their oil industry under General Cardenas. So this issue of integration is crucial. On the Argentine aspect in particular, I want to take note of something, which is that along with the lawfare attacks on former President Cristina Kirchner, one of her most important ministers, Minister of Development, Julio Debido, who has spoken at Schiller Institute conferences and so on, is currently in jail. He has been jailed. He is facing possible death because he's being denied treatment for diabetes and other medical conditions. This is only one example of thousands, millions around the world, but I did want to single it out because of Argentina's historic role, as with the Drago Doctrine, and what allies of ours there require in terms of the help of all of us from every country at this time. On integration, Lyndon LaRouche wrote a book called Operación Juárez, Operation Juárez, in 1982, in coordination with the president of Mexico, José López Portillo. Coordination, I mean, on the basis of discussions that he had with López Portillo in the presidential palace in Los Pinos. And LaRouche wrote this in August of 1982, and it presented a global approach to the issue of the debt crisis, the financial crisis, and the need for the kind of integration for the purpose, not just of giving fraternal solidarity, but for development projects. And he laid out in great detail there how to approach the debt, how to approach development, and so on. This was just one of numerous examples of what LaRouche did for Africa, for Asia, for the Middle East, and so on. But I mention that because it has particular importance today. My concluding point. Representatives from Venezuela, Brazil, Guyana, Mexico, and the United States, under normal circumstances, meaning what happens usually, could have a very different type of discussion than what is happening today. As various of today's speakers alluded, there are historical problems, there are historical difficulties, and no one seeks to ignore those. But as we are doing here, we are searching for a higher level of unity, integration, of approach, of development, of defense of sovereignty of each and every other country, which is the only context in which those other matters can be resolved. This is why I mentioned the question of what the Pope said about Nicholas of Cusa. And I'm hoping that Helga will say something about this because I think this is so crucial to the entire strategic situation and the very discussion we are having here. Because Nicholas of Cusa, the Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, presented an approach to solve local and smaller and national difficulties by always going to the higher level of a solution. And the fact that the Pope has, in fact, turned back to Cusa and that approach provides us, I think, the conceptual, the moral, the cultural approach needed to solve the Venezuela crisis, to solve the U.S.-Russian crisis, to solve the U.S.-China crisis, to solve the world crisis in its entirety. And I, for my part, would like to thank every one of the participants in this for having contributed to that kind of discussion, which simply demonstrates that this is exactly the approach that can be taken globally. And I now would ask Helga to hopefully expand on this concept, as I know she has often done.
But before she does that, we have to go to Mr. Siqueira. Please.
Of course.
Very much. I want to keep it short, of course. We've been,
Voy a ser corto, ya saben.
Venezuela has been under
Venezuela
Yes, for
We
You're in
have
the
you
wrong
in the
channel.
English channel,
for a very
Gabriela,
long time.
interpreter.
And we have gone, I mean, I'm talking about a quarter century of being under US pressure, under US imperialist pressure in many forms and shapes. It has been worse the last 11 years, which have been, they have tried everything. Hybrid warfare, unconventional warfare, color-coded revolutions, to tense up the state structures of Venezuela, trying to make the legislative power go rogue, try to create fake presidencies, recently tried to sequester also the electoral power, which is one of the 5 tenets of our state, which is based on the Bolivarian state, without success. And each and every of these failures create also vacuums that are going to be filled by us and by other players that are looking for a better world. I think it was 3 weeks ago. It was October the 31st, Friday, October 31st. There was this sense that you can relate it to psychological warfare or different elements that really sent the feeling that something was actually going to happen regarding the buildup and the threats against Venezuela. This was the 31st. I realized that in hindsight, after gathering all the elements that were around. Regardless of if it's true or not, I'm not able to prove it, or the reasons that it didn't happen, if so. But one thing is sure. That day, Bloomberg covered a news, which was basically that given the uncertainty and the possibility, based on 2 reports, one by the Wall Street Journal and another one by Miami Herald, that the US was actually going to attack military targets, that West Texas started surging dramatically up. And this was covered by Bloomberg. My point with this is that it clearly shows how harmful it is to do harm to us, to the US society in that sense, and how actually interconnected it is, and perhaps how psychopathological it is for some actors to go against everything, against any notion of stability, be it the energy market or others, in order to achieve some ideological goals, in order to follow maybe the Michael Ledeen infamous quote about trying to get a small country and throw it around and show who's boss. And of course, all these approaches have proven wrong. So here is for the strongest possibility of doing it right. And I'd like to thank you all because of how this has been proven, I thought, and how it is possible to reach this point. So thank you very much for inviting me. All the people involved in this, Dennis, Morela, and everyone else, it has been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. So, Helga?
Well, the question of integration has been brought up by both Dennis and also Mr. Agueda. And, I think that is a very important concept right now, because when Lopez Portillo invited my husband to help him to defend the peso against capital flight, my husband not only responded to that by writing a program for the defense of Mexico, but for the integration of all of Latin America. And he called it Operation Juarez, to refer to the historic cooperation between Benito Juarez and Lincoln to emphasize the fundamental joint interest between the different Americas. Now, López Portillo started to implement Operation Juarez. On the 1st of September 82, he imposed capital controls and he wanted to proceed. Then his term ended too early to go through with the whole program. And the problem was at that time, the other key debtor countries, Brazil and Argentina, did not show solidarity with Portillo's efforts, and therefore it did not go all the way. But he started to implement it, and it just happened to be that on that same day, the 1st September 82, Lynn and I were having a meeting with the leadership of the Kreditanstalt für Wiederaufbau in Frankfurt. And as he was imposing capital controls, we were just greeting each other and saying hello and so forth. And in comes the largest trader of exchanges from the Frankfurt Stock Exchange. And he said, oh, everything is finished. The Latin Americans have declared the debt bomb. The banking system is finished. And Lynn and I were just smiling and said, no, don't worry. This is not the debt bomb. This is just an effort to have an orderly reorganization of the Latin American debt, which was at that time $200 billion, which compared to the sums today was the proverbial peanuts. But, it was enough to scare the banking system in Wall Street that the Latin American countries would use the debt bomb against them. And my husband started to explain, no, this is just an effort to reorganize the totally bankrupt system and transform short-term debt with high interest into long-term credit lines with low interest in order to have new credit for investment in productive investments of infrastructure and other projects of the Latin American integration. Now, if that approach was valid in 82, now more than 40 years later, it is still an absolutely valid point, because if there is no addressing of this everything bubble, of $4 quadrillion of outstanding debt, derivatives, now the AI bubble and the military-industrial complex bubble interwoven, we are sitting under the Damocles sword of that. But the approach which was proposed by Lyndon LaRouche in 82 would still be the available method to deal with it, to have an orderly reorganization, turn the unpayable debt through reorganization into credit lines for investment. And given the fact that the BRICS countries are absolutely trying to find a new payment system to, basically develop an own economic system, the effort to create the Shanghai Cooperation Bank as quickly as possible as an additional means to other institutions like the Asian Investment Bank or the New Development Bank, and basically try to save the world financial system, or their part of the world financial system, from the impact of the pending collapse of the everything bubble. So I think if the BRICS would approach the United States and basically offer some kind of a cooperation to have such an orderly reorganization, I think it could go a long way. Maybe not with everybody it concerns, but maybe there are other channels who could be activated around that. Now, I think, the need to come to a different method of thinking is absolutely there. Now, President Trump has acknowledged publicly that he thinks that the building of the Bering Strait tunnel is an interesting idea. When this was asked of him after the Alaska conference, where the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, Kirill Dmitriev, who is a known proponent of the Bering Strait, he has talked about the enormous economic benefits It would have, opening up all of the east of Russia, Siberia, the Arctic region, where there are all the worlds, of the periodic table, but not developed. President Trump acknowledged that he finds that an interesting idea. Now, if you build the Bering Strait tunnel, you could very soon, a few years later, build a fast train system which would connect a rail line from the southern tip of Argentina and Chile all the way up through the Americas, crossing the Darien Gap, going through the Central American countries, reaching North America, Canada, Alaska, going through the Bering Strait tunnel, going all the way through Eurasia to Gibraltar, Portugal, Spain, build the Gibraltar tunnel and connect through a fast train system all the way through Africa to the tip of the Cape of Good Hope. And you could, in a few years, travel with a fast train system all around the world, because other networks would go to India and Indonesia, and with other means connecting the world in this way. Now, if you think about the long arc of history, that will happen if we don't blow ourselves up. It is natural that infrastructure, which started at riversides and oceans, and when the railway was invented, people could open up the interior of the continents. And we are now looking at the last phase of the opening up of all continents through infrastructure development, making it livable for all people on this planet. Now, as I said, if we don't blow ourselves up in a thermonuclear war, this will happen. It may be interrupted, but that is the natural course of development of the human species. So why can we not take this program of the new Silk Road, which becomes the World Land Bridge, which is a study which we published in 2014 after President Xi Jinping announced the new Silk Road, and put that on the table, because it would solve all the problems. It would solve the problem of poverty and migration, migrants in Latin America, in Africa. We could reconstruct the Middle East with the Oasis plan. And, why can we not elevate the human mind to the level of the interest of everybody? A new paradigm which puts the idea of the one humanity first. And since Dennis mentioned it, the concept for that is the method of thinking of the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposite, which is a revolutionary method of thinking which was invented by Nicolaus of Cusa, who was the cardinal in 15th century. He is the inventor of the modern nation state, because in his writing Concordantia Catholica, he presented for the first time in history ever the concept of the representative system, and the idea that the government is only legitimate with the consent of the governed, and that the representatives have a reciprocal relationship between the government and the governed, and they have to basically make sure that there is the interest of both represented. But he was also the author of the idea of a concordantia, that the concordance in the world as a large can only be if all microcosms develop and regard it as their self-interest to develop the other microcosm, meaning the other nation. Now, this method of the coincidence of opposite, it's a very fascinating concept, and I would need a lot more time to explain it. He himself was aware that this was a complete revolutionary way of approaching things, because he said, I'm now thinking something which no human being ever before was thinking. And he came to it naturally through a theological discussion, which I will shorten now. It's basically that there is a capability of the human mind to always think the higher one, which is of a higher magnitude and a higher order than the many. Naturally, he came through that to that idea through a theological reflection, but it is a method which can be applied to any problem, any field of science or culture. And I have made it my habit for now actually several decades to apply that method of thinking of the coincidence of opposite, because it helps you tremendously not to get stuck in little details or not to get stuck in secondary or tertiary contradictions, but to always think the one which is maybe something new, because he also, Nikolaus also said you have to have always prescience, foreknowledge of what you are looking for, because if you don't know what you are looking for, you may find something and you don't know if it is what you were searching for. So you have to have that prescience, and that prescience, if it's based on a methodological approach, will always guide you to come up with the solution on a higher level. Now, I think historically that higher level must be that we make the jump to think not nation first, not MAGA, not America first, or Russia first, or Venezuela first, Brazil first, but to think the one humanity first, and then define the national interest in cohesion with that one. I think the statesman who is thinking that way also since a long time is Xi Jinping, because he is talking about the shared community of mankind. And he has also, by the way, developed 4 global initiatives: the Global Security, Development, Civilizational, and Governance Initiative, who in totality represent exactly an approach which we have from the Schiller Institute pursued also now for several years, which is the idea that we absolutely need to have a new security and development architecture, which must take into account the interest of every single country, because it does not function if you leave out 1 or 2 countries. And you can actually go back to the Peace of Westphalia, which did bring peace because it did develop this concept of the interest of the other, which must be taken into account. And whenever that principle was applied, you find peace. And whenever that was not applied, like in the Versailles Treaty, it was the prelude to the next war. So I think what we urgently need, and maybe we can take this discussion today as a jumping point to have more such panels, maybe involving all the think tanks of Latin America and maybe also other parts of the world. Maybe we have some think tanks in the United States who would be suitable to participate in that, and start to discuss how can we give ourselves a governance system which allows the survival of humanity as a whole. I mean, that was the topic in the Federalist Papers in the young American Republic. And, if we don't have that discussion on a global scale, well, then we are not doing our job as human beings.
Thank you very much, Helga. We've come to the conclusion of today's forum. We have one item of business. I first of all want to thank Diane Sayer, Morella Barreto Lopez, Dennis Small, Beto Almeida, Ray McGovern, Donald Ramatar, and Diego Siqueira, and of course, Helga Sepp-LaRouche for being part of this. So here's my 2 items of business. First of all, I have to ask Mr. Almeida concerning the painting that I'm seeing behind the drawing. Is that Don Quixote, Rocinante, and Don Quixote's lance? No, the other one, behind on your right, to your right. Yes. What is that? I'm not hearing you.
Essa pintura de Portinari, grande
That's the portrait
brasileiro que isso nos
of a
murales
great
da-
Brazilian who did
edifícios de la
murals
ONU, Guerra e
of
Paz
the
também.
UN
E aqui
murals.
ele vaqueiro do Nordeste. É
Mhm.
muito expressivo.
And he was known
Ele
as
também
the
pintou Guerra
cowboy.
e Paz, não?
Uh-huh.
Na ONU.
And what is the other one?
And what is the other? I'm sorry.
Sorry. No, the other.
Muy fuerte. Bastante fuerte. Né?
Yes, and the other painting. The other drawing.
Essa sim, de Don Quixote.
Yes,
Esse é
that's
regalo que
Don
ganhei quando
Quixote.
fui a
Is
Cuba.
a gift I got when I went to Cuba. It was a gift they gave me in Cuba.
All right.
Yes.
Now here's why I asked you. I knew it was Don Quixote because I could see he was defeated. He's leaning on Rocinante and his lance is broken. And it seems to me that that is a good metaphor for what we've been talking about all day. President Trump, don't do it. Because that's what happens when you tilt at windmills and you think they're great enemies. Also, remember, Quixote still thought he was right, even after that. So the second element of business is Ray McGovern. I'd like you to help me do something. This forum was sponsored by Executive Intelligence Review. It's a magazine that was founded by Lyndon LaRouche, economist and statesman, back in 1974, May of 74, April of 74, excuse me, 51 years ago. And we have been honored to have all of you here with us, but we are also on a mission, and that is to expand our publication and expand the dialogues that it stands for. We believe the idea is that reason has to prevail. And Ray has sometimes said a few things about this. If you would, Ray, like to help me in making the point to everybody, EIR.news, by the way, news at EIR.news is the website. If people have questions, by the way, who've been watching, and you'd like us to refer any of those questions to any of the panelists or the commentators, write us at news@EIR.news. So Ray, any words concerning Executive Intelligence Review? Please unmute.
Dennis, I welcome the chance to say what I think of the EIR. It's evolved over the decades. I spent a career as a journalist at the CIA, coping with current intelligence, okay? We did a current intelligence bulletin 6 days a week to keep policymakers up to date on what's going on. I don't know what that looks like now, but I can tell you that if it predicts that Ukraine's still going to win in Ukraine, well, it's not worth anything. What is worth something is your publication, the EIR. Now, no joke here. I turn to that first thing in the morning, as I did this morning, and it gives me the background for many of my later interviews or publications or speeches or whatever. In other words, it keeps me up to date. I think it's also 6 days a week or maybe even 7, but I applaud the expertise that goes into it. And it is a paragon of good current intelligence reporting, even though it's called the Executive Intelligence Review. It's current intelligence. As my son tells me, who runs my website, you should say this, Dad. Well, in this connection, with respect to the EIR, if you don't get it, you don't get it.
Thank you very much, Ray. And by the way, yes, it is in fact 7 days a week, because you have to think 7 days a week. We stand for reason in a time of crisis, and there's a crisis every day. So on behalf of Executive Intelligence Review, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank the audience. I want to thank you all for what you have done and what you will be doing. This concludes our forum, President Trump, Don't Do It, an alternative American policy for the Caribbean.